Here's a powerful hook to open the story for a U.S. audience, followed immediately by the full narrative in one long paragraph as requested. Before this story ends, you'll understand why respect can save lives, and why underestimating someone can cost everything. So if you believe stories like this matter, hit subscribe now because the truth you're about to hear is the kind they don't teach anymore. They laughed when she stepped through the glass doors of Patriot Arms on a bright Tuesday morning. Not cruel laughter at first, just the careless kind that comes from people who think they already know how the world works. The bell above the door chiming softly as Eleanor Whitaker entered with slow, measured steps, silver hair pinned neatly at the nape of her neck, posture straight despite the years, her cardigan pressed, her eyes sharp and observant in a way none of the three young clerks noticed at first because all they saw was age, the wrinkles, the sensible shoes, the woman who looked more like she was there to ask for directions than to buy anything that fired around. And the tallest clerk nudged the other and muttered something about, "Grandma wandered into the wrong store." And Eleanor heard it. Of course she did. She'd heard worse in her 81 years, but she said nothing. Just walked slowly along the wall of firearms, her fingers hovering just above the glass, not touching, respecting the tools the way she always had. And when the youngest clerk finally approached with a smirk and a rehearsed tone that dripped with false politeness, asking if she was looking for a gift for her grandson, something small and simple maybe, Eleanor turned her head and looked at him fully then, really looked, and there was something in her gaze that made him hesitate. But he laughed it off and kept talking, explaining calibers incorrectly, simplifying everything as if she were a child. And when she asked calmly if they carried a discontinued match-grade pistol from the late 1980s, the kind produced in limited runs with a specific rifling pattern, all three clerks burst out laughing because they didn't even know what she was referring to. And one of them said, "Ma'am, those are collector pieces, not really. Beginner-friendly." And that word beginner landed wrong, landed heavy, because Eleanor had fired her first weapon before any of those boys had been born, before their fathers had even considered settling down. But she smiled politely and asked if she could see their inventory list anyway, and the manager on duty, a man in his 40s with a goatee and a sense of superiority earned from knowing just enough to be dangerous, overheard and came over, dismissing her with a wave and telling her they didn't have time to entertain fantasies, suggesting a nice pepper spray instead. And that was when something shifted, not in Eleanor's expression, which remained calm, but in the air itself, because the door chimed again, and a man in a tailored suit stepped inside, scanning the store with purpose, his presence commanding immediate attention, conversation stopping mid-sentence, and the manager's face drained of color because he recognized him instantly. Daniel Crow, the CEO of Patriot Arms, the man whose name was etched into the brand, whose word could make or break careers. And Daniel wasn't looking at the displays or the staff. He was looking straight at Eleanor, crossing the store in long strides until he stopped in front of her and said, clearly, respectfully, loudly enough for everyone to hear, "Good morning, ma'am. I didn't expect to see you here." And the room froze, the clerk's mouth slightly open as Daniel extended his hand, and Eleanor took it with a nod, replying that she was in town unexpectedly and needed to make a purchase. And Daniel turned slowly to the staff, his eyes cold now, and asked why she hadn't been helped properly, and the manager stammered something about misunderstanding when Daniel cut him off and said, "This woman trained half the people who taught me everything I know." And that was the first twist, the first crack in the story they thought they understood, because Eleanor Whitaker wasn't just an old woman wandering into a gun store. She was a legend whose name had been buried under decades of classified files and forgotten headlines, a former federal marksman instructor, a consultant. During the restructuring of national firearms training protocols, a woman who had been quietly instrumental in shaping the standards that Patriot Arms itself was built to serve. And as Daniel escorted her behind the counter, showing her private inventory, the clerks stood frozen, replaying every word they'd said, every laugh, every look, realizing too late that they had mocked someone who had once testified before Congress, someone who had stood on ranges teaching discipline, safety, and responsibility, when most women weren't even allowed in those spaces. And Eleanor listened as Daniel apologized, not with corporate emptiness, but apologized. Not with corporate emptiness, but with genuine respect. And she waved it away, saying she wasn't offended, just disappointed, because she'd hoped times had changed more than they apparently had. And as they talked, another customer, a loud man who'd been watching with irritation, scoffed and muttered that age didn't make someone an expert, that respect should be earned daily. And Eleanor turned then, her eyes settling on him, and she asked calmly if he'd like to see something, and Daniel hesitated, but nodded, clearing a private lane at the attached range, and Eleanor removed her cardigan, revealing arms still strong, movements precise, loading a weapon with muscle memory that never fades. And when she fired, the shots were clean, controlled, grouping tighter than any of the staff had ever managed, and silence followed, heavy and undeniable. Because skill doesn't age the way bodies do. And the man who'd scoffed said nothing as Eleanor set the weapon down and thanked Daniel for his time, explaining she didn't actually need to buy anything because she'd wanted to see whether the culture she helped build still honored what it was meant to. And Daniel's jaw tightened because he knew the answer now, and he promised her changes, real ones, not just training videos, but mentorship, accountability, respect baked into the walls. And Eleanor nodded, satisfied but not triumphant, because she'd never been in this for praise, only for standards. And as she turned to leave, the youngest clerk, the one who'd laughed first, called out an apology, voice shaking, and Eleanor stopped, looked at him, and said softly that everyone starts ignorant, but choosing to stay that way is a decision. And when she left, the bell chimed again. But the store felt different, heavier, quieter, and Daniel gathered the staff, his voice firm as he explained who Eleanor was, what she'd done, and why respect isn't optional. And later that week, the manager was gone, policies rewritten, and a framed photo appeared behind the counter of a younger Eleanor at a range, teaching, focused, powerful, with a small plaque that read, "Honor the hands that built the path you walk." And customers asked about it. And the story spread, not as a viral scandal, but as a quiet lesson. And somewhere across the country, Eleanor returned to her modest home, content not because she'd been recognized, but because she'd reminded a new generation that wisdom doesn't announce itself loudly, that age isn't weakness, and that sometimes the most dangerous thing in a room isn't the weapon on the wall, but the assumptions in your head. And if this story made you pause, made you rethink who you underestimate, then subscribe now, because stories like this still matter, and the next one might change the way you see someone forever.